So you should have just watched two clips. One from the 1979 made-for-TV movie, which showed a lot of stuff blowing up.
Yep.
And then one talking about, one with Boimer and a French soldier in a trench. And this is probably the most famous scene from the book, and probably the most famous scene from the movies, where he kills this man. He feels horrible about it. He comes to see this man as a human being, and that's really the scene that it captures something really important about this book. But let's talk about that first scene first. Dr. McFall, what did you think about? You're the World War I expert. What did you think about that first stuff blowing up scene?
The first thing to say about that is to recognize how much we know now that we did not know then about what happened in World War I. And we've learned an enormous amount in the last 40 years. And the broad conclusion from what we know now is that they didn't actually get the scene right on the details. There's lots of issues. It's not worth going into them here.
So TV was wrong?
It's hard to believe that TV was
wrong. And the internet is wrong?
Once in a very, very long time.
Okay.
Once in a very,
you heard it here.
That's why you paid your tuition.
Yeah.
But
okay.
But what's important to know, I guess, is to say that while the details are wrong with this in a number of ways, the spirit of this is right on. Because what this scene, I think, shows you is the hopelessness and the lack of purpose, or at least lack of accomplishment, lack of achievement that happens in the kind of everyday battles of World War I on the Western Front. And it's important to note that this novel is a Western Front novel. We won't go into the details, but the rest of the war is different. But here, you get a real sense from this scene about the fact that these people are dying or getting wounded or getting injured for no real purpose. There's an attack. There's a counterattack. In the end, lots of people are dead. Everybody's back at the same lines they started on. And that's really the story of much of the war for the individual soldier on the front.
And that's kind of built into the title of the novel, right?
Yeah.
All Quiet on the Western Front.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that come from?
Yeah. So that comes specifically from a phrase that is generated as part of reports that go up from the front through the German, in particular, in this case, it's the German lines of command. And the German would be "Im Westen nichts Neues," which strictly translates to "In the West, nothing new." Which is roughly what the English version says.
And is that the title of the book in German?
The title of,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And then it goes out to the newspapers, right? And you see it in the book in the very end,
mm-hmm.
right? And this is where it's really important to read the book as opposed to just watching the movie and thinking that it stands in for the book. At the end of the book, and in fact, you could see this in the way the type is set, right? Because at least in my edition, you think that the book ends on page 295. There's blank space at the bottom. And then at the end, you've got this kind of coda, again, set off with the blank space at the top of the page. And then you get this kind of after-action report, right? Not in first person anymore, now in third person, reporting what happened to Boimer, reporting that he died.
He fell in October 1918 on a day that was so quiet and still on the whole front that the Army report confined itself to the single sentence, "All quiet on the Western Front." And that's, you have this whole book about this guy and his thoughts and his feelings, and and a very poignant book in a lot of ways. And then his death is presented as something completely meaningless.
Yes.
By the Army especially, because the dispatch right after he died is nothing of any significance happened on the Western Front.
And again, this is where you have to read the book, because in the movie they've tried to create some kind of significance to this moment. Because in the movie it ends as he reaches out toward a butterfly, symbolizing beauty or perhaps freedom, something that is worth striving for. And while his death is tragic and sad, it is not meaningless.
It means something.
Yeah.
He's died for art.
Yeah. And in this book, there's no meaning attached. He just dies, right, in this kind of flat, affective, objective prose, which ends, right, after that paragraph, the last few sentences, "He had fallen forward and lay on the earth as though sleeping. Turning him over, one saw that he could not have suffered long. His face had an expression of calm, as though almost glad the end had come. Right. There's nothing attained. He's just happy that it's done.
Yeah, and that's I think what the book is probably most famous for is an anti-war book.
Yeah.
This became for generations kind of the pacifist book, probably not entirely accurately, but if you look at the preface, this book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war. Now, do you buy that, Dr. McFall? This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession?
No.
Because it sure seems like an accusation.
It seems like an accusation to me. And he's, I think, again, putting on this air of neutrality so that people will read him as being objective.
So I'm not anti-war, I'm pro-fact, and the facts are anti-war.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, I will say, also in there, what you recognize is that the person has changed, right? Because this is Remarque talking, not Boehmer.
Right.
And Remarque is talking about, while the novel ends in the death of the hero, in fact, what he really is wanting to do is help you to understand the people who lived.
Yeah. And which Remarque was one, right?
Yep.
He went through probably not all of these events, but there is some confession here,
Yes.
some autobiography,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So would you consider this an anti-war book or an anti-this war book?
I think it's an anti-this war book. Now, I don't overstate that because I think he recognizes the tragedy of loss that is inherent in all wars. But I think this is, in fact, an accusation, and it's an accusation against a generation of people, and particularly the subset of a generation that was in charge, that got Germany, and thus he and his friends, into a war that seemed meaningless, a war that ended without success, a war that cost millions of lives, and as he says there, right, didn't just cost millions of lives, but sent a whole generation back home in a state where their lives were done, even though they were alive. And we'll put this up. There's a fabulous, I guess it's a drawing, by my favorite German artist, Katja Kollwitz. And if you look at this...
We're going to be splicing that in right now, post-production. You are seeing this now.
So as you look at this painting, it's a very simple painting, all in black and white. And what you see are what you might call veterans, right? Some of them clearly military combat veterans. Some of them people who are civilians, young children, older people who lived through the war on the home front. In either case, they just stare out at you with this blank, devastated look, right? In the military phrase, it's the 1,000-yard stare, the sense in which they're looking through you, they're not looking at you, because they can't look at you anymore, because their ability to be a whole person has been destroyed.
Now, this is also, to some extent at least, an anti-nationalist book.
Yes, very much so.
The nationalist sentiment is what got them into the war. The idea that a German and a Frenchman were just fundamentally different species, different organisms, which is what the next scene is going to make very problematic. But Germany, World War I was not the high point of German nationalism.
No.
They had a higher point than that
That's
in
right.
World War II. How did this book play in the Nazi regime?
Just as a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar, remember that in the 1920s, Germany was a democracy. It was a troubled democracy with dozens of parties, all of which had a different understanding of the problem and a different vision for where Germany should go. And in the 20s, some of them adopted this novel as a manifesto, right? This demonstrated all that was wrong with the old Germany. But
it was bad that we got into the war.
Yeah, it was bad that we were nationalistic. It was bad that we were militaristic, and we need to steer away. Other parts of this political spectrum, though, rejected that diagnosis and said that German nationalism was an essential and appropriate kind of identity, that looking at the world through the lens of nationalism or race, and those concepts are very closely related, especially at this time, was the right way to look at the world, and that this novel, in fact, was dangerous to the people who read it.
So these are people who thought that we weren't nationalistic and militaristic enough.
That's right.
If we had just done nationalism better.
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, they thought that the people in the war who weren't nationalist enough were the civilians at home. And what they were terrified of is that the civilians in the new war, will have read this and will be just as defeatist and just as anti-war as they perceived the German civilians in World War I to be. Right? So this is a political danger. It is also, though, a moral danger, right? Because what we have to remember is that while a lot of people exit the war understanding that or believing that the war demonstrated the problems or the dangers of militarism and of heroism, there are other people who believe that the war was actually a cultural high point, that the values that are traditionally associated with combat, of being strong, of being heroic, of being honorable, that those are the values that should be reinforced and lived in again in New Germany, and that this was a moral threat, especially to kids who are reading this in high schools and who will think that they need to be kind and weak. And those words go together in the minds of the Nazis. By being kind is being weak.
So during the rise of Nazism, there's, if I'm interpreting correctly, there is sort of a war of interpretation of World War I.
That's correct.
It's like there's one side that's saying getting into a war for no particular reason was dumb, and that's what caused all of these problems. And there's another side that said we just didn't do it right. Yeah.
And in fact, what you'll see here is that this is a course in some ways about how combat is remembered by the people in it, but it's also a course, at least a little bit, about how people use those memories. Mm-hmm. And so here's this book, right? And it's this book that is used by a big part of the All Quiet on the Western Front, that's used by a big part of German society to interpret the war and to persuade people that their interpretation is right. There's an equivalent book on the other side, a book by a guy named Ernst Jünger, who's a conservative militarist nationalist, called Storm of Steel, which, if you read it, is a kind of celebration of the violence and pain and experience of World War I. And the Nazi Party basically says, our book is right, your book is dangerous, and when they get into power, they make sure that you can't read the Remarque book by making it illegal.
Now let's go to the French soldier.
Yeah,
because that's what I said. This is a scene. When I read this book in high school, that's the only thing I remembered for many years. The scene with the soldier. And first of all, is it important that the soldier is French and not English? Or is that just the most likely way for it to happen?
I don't know. That's never occurred to me. I think it is the most likely way it would happen.
Okay.
I'm not really sure. That I don't know. And the reason I don't know is I don't know enough about Remarque. There's a part of German society that vilifies England as the essential enemy. In fact, there's a poem that comes out in 1914 by a guy named Lissauer titled The Hymn of Hate, which talks about all of the different ways you have to hate the English.
The French had poems like that, too.
The French did.
For hundreds of years.
Yes, they did.
And the English hated the French back.
Well...
But they didn't really hate the Germans that much until World War I.
Not until World War I. Yeah. But I don't think for most people that distinction mattered. I think the distinction that mattered, the important one, is when he gets out the ID and gets a name, right, and realizes that this is a person, not a French person.
So let's look at that. This is page 223 in this volume. And he's killed the man.
Yeah.
And he jumped into the trench, and then he saw the enemy soldier, and he did what you're supposed to do with an enemy soldier. He stabbed him. Yeah. And then he dies very slowly, and in a way that because they're trapped in the trench, because there's a battle raging above them, he has to just sit there and watch this guy die. And then he takes out the ID, and all of a sudden, this becomes a human being with a life, a wife, children, a family. And all of a sudden he goes from sort of a them to an us. Yep. So page 223. The silence spreads. I talk and must talk, so I speak to him and say to him, Comrade, I did not want to kill you. If you jumped in here again, I would not do it, if you would be sensible too. But you were only an idea to me before, an abstraction that lived in my mind and called forth its appropriate response. It was that abstraction I stabbed. But now, for the first time, I see you are a man like me. I thought of your hand grenades, of your bayonet, of your rifle. Now I see your wife and your face and our fellowship. Forgive me, comrade. We always see it too late. Why do they never tell us that you are poor devils like us? That your mothers are just as anxious as ours, that we have the same fear of death and the same dying and the same agony? Forgive me, comrade. How could you be my enemy? If we threw away these rifles and this uniform, you could be my brother, just like Cat and Albert. Take 20 years of my life, comrade, and stand up. Take more, for I do not know what I can even attempt to do with it now.
So what does he need forgiveness for?
Well, that's an interesting question. What is he? He needs the forgiveness, not of God,
Mm-hmm.
but of this man who is dead
Yeah.
and can't forgive him.
Mm-hmm.
What does he need forgiveness for?
I mean, I think the first time you read it, I think the instant assumption you make is he needs forgiveness for killing him. But I'm not actually sure that's what he means, right? Because I think he might mean, forgive me for not recognizing you were a person.
And it seems, when you read something like this, from our perspective, it seems obvious. This guy's German, that guy's French, they're both people.
Mm-hmm.
During a war, though, you have a whole lot going on to turn the other side into a them. And, French and German, they're pretty similar in the world today. I'm not sure you could isolate very many genetic differences.
And it's for American audiences, it's worth remembering, these are not big places, right? So this is kind of like talking about Kansas and Missouri. Right? Germany's bigger than Kansas, but Kansas and Nebraska together opposing Iowa and Missouri. And so from American perspectives, it just seems silly that they would be these ultra enemies. They're just miles down the road.
So how in a war does this happen? Because there's a they. Why did they never tell us? Who are the they and what have the they done?
So partly the dehumanization that happens, and that's kind of the academic word that's used, right? The process of making them something other than human is an intentional part of the training that the military produces. Because armies and air forces and navies know full well there's something about being human that leaves us unwilling, or at least unhappy about trying to kill somebody else. Right? So they have to get that out of you. And so if you actually know anything about basic training, you have everything from drills to chants to songs, ways that you are taught to view the other side as an enemy, as something else, as something not like you. Right? That also happens on a national level with various kind of propaganda. But I think it also happens just coming out of human nature, right? We are bred to be groupish.
Mm-hmm.
And in a world where your friends all wear one kind of uniform and those people over there all wear another kind of uniform, it is somewhat human to gradually understand them to be different. And it's a small step from saying they are different from you to saying they are less than you.
Now, what happens, and this really is something we're going to explore throughout here, but what happens when that, because we do, as fellow human beings, we do have a connection.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just sort of walking up to somebody and killing them for no reason. Most of us would be horrified by that. Any other human being. So what happens afterwards, after that bond has been broken for the sake of a war? What happens to the soldier who survives?
That's an interesting question. And there's lots of discussion about this. One thing I think everybody agrees on is that it's easier to kill the second person than the first. And it's easier to kill the 10th than the second. And this doesn't change once you're back home, right? And that doesn't mean that a veteran is going to walk down to QT or somewhere and start a shooting spree. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that killing people changes you somehow in a way that doesn't end. Right? It is somewhat context-driven. That's important to remember too. But it doesn't change. It makes you a different person. And that, in a lot of ways, is what these people we will be reading this semester are struggling with, as to how to adjust. how to understand themselves now that they're different.
Is this part of what he's saying by those who
Yeah.
may have escaped the shells were destroyed by the war?
Mm-hmm.
That in order to turn people into soldiers,
Yeah.
and then have them be soldiers, it makes changes that are difficult to undo.
Yeah. And so one great way to understand this is, and again, this is on the Western Front. In 1914 at Christmas time, there's an informal truce that happens all along the front. How that's decided varies from place to place. It might be people yelling at each other from across the no man's land, the area between the trench. It might be that they toss a message over to the other side. This is not something decreed from the upper level. And the upper level, the generals and the colonels and so on, they hate this idea because what they see is soldiers of both sides cooking together and picking the lice off each other and playing soccer together. And what they are terrified about is that this will remind people that they're all humans, and it will make it harder for their own soldiers to fight the next day when the truce is over. That truce never happens again. By 1915, the idea that the other side is different and lesser has been so ingrained in everybody that it never occurs to them.
This, have you ever seen this book?
No.
Robert Axelrod, The Evolution of Cooperation. He's a computer scientist at Michigan State University, I believe.
A good school.
Who did, you went there,
I did.
Yeah. He did fascinating computer experiments, game theory experiments around what's called the prisoner's dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a game, very simple game, where somebody has to either cooperate or defect. And cooperation gives minimal gains. If you defect and the other person cooperates, you get maximum gains. If you both defect, you get maximum punishment. So that scenario, and he hosted a very famous computer tournament where game theorists created computer programs and pitted these decision rules against each other. And what he found was that always offering to cooperate always won. And then he goes into talking about World War I and talking about situations, the live and let live system in trench warfare in World War I. And let's see if I can just get a passage out of it. Well, to describe it, he would say that there were soldiers who, without ever announcing it, just for long periods of time, agreed not to shoot.
So this is based, I've not read the book, but my guess is it's based on research by a guy named Tony Ashworth, who's actually written a book called The Live and Let Live System.
Yeah, that's...
And the idea is that when we think of World War I, we think of the big battle scenes that are described here. But in fact, for much of the war, there are big stretches of the front line that are quiet because all of the energy and resources are focused on a small area, right? And in those areas that are quiet, much to the anger and distress of the colonels and majors and generals, what happens is the evolution of an informal system of cooperation that units create spontaneously to make sure that it can be as safe and as comfortable as you can possibly make it, right? And there are signals decided so that when one unit is ready to withdraw and go to retreat and go somewhere else, they give the signal so the other side knows now to be careful because new guys are moving in and you've got to create this system again with some other unit. And this is a way to make this kind of experience tolerable.
That just fascinates me. This emerges out of the war, this extended system of cooperation and agreement, and it almost becomes the soldiers against the commanders on both sides. Joseph Heller, a very famous book, Catch-22, writes that in a war, the enemy is whoever's going to get you killed, no matter what side he's on. Yeah.
So that hooks back to the scene, because the scene, I think, the ending of the scene is as important or more important than the rest of it. Mm-hmm. So I will start by saying what most historians and most veterans understood is that what emerges is a group, is an informal kind of identity of people as frontline soldiers. And you are a frontline soldier if you're a German frontline soldier, or if you're a French, or you're an English, and it's the common perception that you have more in common with the other frontline soldier from the other side than you do with anybody at home on your own country, because you are the only people who understand the experience you're having. And I think that's a really important notion, and I think it's true. But when you look at this scene, he's got this kind of anguish, kind of self-contemplation, and in some places self-loathing. But it ends with him getting rescued. And that chapter says, at the end, right, you don't need, this is Albert, one of his friends, right? You don't need to lose any sleep over your affair. This says Albert, this is 229. And now I hardly understand it myself anymore. It was only because I had to lie there with him so long, I say, after all, war is war. And that identity, that tie, that bond between Boehmer and this French person that was so important for him,
Gerard Duval.
yeah, is now gone. And the war has taken it over.
Yeah. So is Boehmer sensing that he's becoming changed?
I think so.
And that he's losing his ability
Yeah.
to make these kinds of connections.
And
Okay.
he almost needs double forgiveness, right? Because not only has he killed this person, not only does he now know that he forgot that they were the same, but now he's forgetting again. And he doesn't even realize anymore that he needs forgiveness.
Yeah. Okay. Well, any final thoughts on this? I mean, you've got here a very complex novel, and we're going to ask you, and we'll have the assignment posted for a bulletin board assignment to talk about some aspects of this novel. But it's working on several different levels at once to talk about both the larger picture of what happens, but also the sort of internal picture of a human being, probably more than anything else. What happens to a sensitive, intelligent, creative, educated human being who is put in this situation where not only is there nothing that he can do to affect his fate, but nothing that he does in any conceivable way matters. He's going to die, and all will be quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add, because this is the first book we're reading, is to recognize that this is, if not the greatest war novel of all time, which is what my copy says, but it's the best known war novel of all time. So everybody we are going to read from now on will have read this, and in some way is dialoguing with it and engaging with the themes that he's laid out. And so as you read the following books, with the possible exception of Hemingway, but even there, I think they're about, I don't remember when that was written, but it's about the same time, and he certainly would have engaged the ideas, if not the book.
Yeah.
So you want to look, as you read the following books, for the ways in which they try and wrestle with the themes and the stylistic choices that he makes in this book.